welcome to the continuation of Unit 2 in Second Language Acquisition. And what we're focused on in this unit is to get a deep sense of what it means for someone to master a language. So we are all entering a profession where we are dedicating ourselves to helping English language learners master English. So what does it mean to master English? Well, in the first part of this unit, we complicated the idea of just the language that's needed in school by breaking it into BICS and CALP, and then we broke it down into contextualized and decontextualized, and then we broke it down with Elaine Turone's help with thinking about the different types of style, really careful style or what's called vernacular style. So now we're going to take another step in a slightly different direction. We're going to take a look at just linguistics. What is language? And I think if I were to leave this room and go out onto the mall here at Eastern or wherever you are, if you were to go outside and to ask someone, what does it mean if someone's learning a language? What are they learning? I bet they would say two things: vocabulary and grammar. That is the usual answer. And that's part of the answer. But what we're going to do is we're going to learn to talk about it in ways that our profession really uses, the terms that we use and the ways that we think. So something beyond grammar and vocabulary. And spoiler alert, there's more to it than just grammar and vocabulary. So let's take a quick look at what are the linguistic systems. So when we ask the question, what makes up a language, there are really these answers that we tend to give. There's semantics, morphology, syntax, phonetics and phonology. They're separate, and we'll talk about how they're different, and pragmatics. Okay? So very quickly, before we launch in, a very quick definition of semantics are the meanings of words and the uses of words. So just as two words may have very similar meanings, but we use them in different contexts, or two words have very different meanings, or they have different structures in a sentence. One acts as a noun, one acts as an adjective. Morphology. Morphology is looking at how you change root words, those basic words, how you add on to them at the beginning or at the end to change the grammatical meaning, to maybe make it plural, to change the part of speech, to show past tense, for example. So that is morphology. Syntax is how you order words in a sentence, right? So in some languages, the subject comes first. English is one of those languages, but not every language is subject, verb, object. So syntax is about the order of the words. Phonetics are the individual sounds that a language contains. So every language has, except for assigned language, every language has consonant sounds and vowel sounds. And the phonetics of a language are that combination. What are all those individual sounds that are made? And when they're put together, if a new special sound is made, what is that? Phonology is how the rules work in a language about what happens when two sounds bump up against each other. So, for example, in some languages, if a consonant sound happens at the end of a word, it's not pronounced. Or if it happens at the end of a word and the next word starts with a consonant as well, you don't pronounce that word ending. That is an example of phonology. It's not the individual sounds that make up the language, but it's the rules, the laws for what happens, for where sounds are placed and whether or not you pronounce them and how they impact each other. Okay? And finally, pragmatics. Pragmatics is looking at what are the ways that in this language you show politeness to others. How do you show appropriateness for a context? That kind of thing. So in our field, one thing that will happen to you over and over again is you will be talking with or reading the writing of an English language learner, and you will see some non-native-like errors. Now notice I didn't just say errors, I added some words before that, non-native-like. And one thing that was just happening in our profession when I was joining it was we stopped worshiping the native speaker as the holder of all information. And we started to recognize that as you're mastering a language, you are somewhere on this pathway. And so we changed a little bit of the way we say things, and saying that someone's errors were non-native-like. It's not saying they don't matter, it's just not quite like someone who's already mastered English would probably produce it. So when you are reading the writing of your English language learners, or when you are talking with them and listening to what they're saying, you will hear errors, non-native-like errors. And one task that you will have over and over again is, if you decide you want to point out the error to them, whether it's right then and there or it's later, or you just want to keep track yourself in terms of where they are in their language learning, you'll need to identify what type of error is it. Now, if you are a native speaker of English, you have an advantage, and that advantage is it just won't sound right. If you are a non-native speaker of English, you have an advantage, because you may not recognize that it doesn't quite sound right, but you've got the next advantage, which is you'll be able to figure out faster why. What is going on? If you've acquired English as your first language, you have a native sense of what falls into the correct use and the incorrect use of language. But because you've acquired it almost like breathing, without thinking, you won't always be able to quickly put into words what is the rule that's being broken, or how is a word being used in this context that really most native-like speakers would not use. And so, but that is the work we have, whether we come to this work as native speakers of English or non-native speakers of English. That is the work that you need to carry out, to recognize where the error is, and to be able to name what the rule is, or how the usage is not following the pattern that you would suggest. And then the next part is to give examples. And so this is where we're headed after this lecture. But for now, let's start out with some utterances. That's a fancy word for things that people say or things that people write. These are 4 utterances that English language learners have said to me or written to me in the past. And by taking a look at all 4 of these and analyzing them, we'll start to get a sense of how these linguistic systems work. Okay? So the very first one, if you can see it up here, it says, "Too big lucky hurt me, I think." Now let me tell you the context for this. When I was teaching at Indiana University, I was teaching a beginning reading class, a high beginning reading class, and I was assigning the students to read lots of fairy tales and fables. And what we were starting to learn to do is to synthesize. So take lots of stories and put them together, and to start to understand what the big idea was. And so I had to include fairy tales and fables in this unit, but I very carefully chose which ones that I had the students read. And in several of them, there was a theme that someone had great luck, amazing luck. They found a genie in a bottle. They found something that gave them 3 wishes, that kind of thing. But almost always the wishes don't work out. Something bad happens to the family, that kind of thing. So as an exit ticket for my students one day, I asked them to just try their best to tell me what they saw across the stories and what they thought about it. And one of my students wrote this: "Too big lucky, hurt me, I think." Now, I read it as he handed it to me, and I didn't understand what he meant, especially since I was a very new teacher, and so I hadn't developed kind of my being able to read between the lines of what students are saying when they're developing in English. And so I asked him, what does it mean? And he said that just like we try to avoid bad luck, he also thought that he should avoid really good luck, because in the end it can hurt you, which is, if you look at the sentence, "Too big lucky, hurt me, I think," it makes sense. It does. So when we look at this sentence, and we know that it doesn't sound like something or look like something that would be said or written by a native-like speaker, one of the things that stands out is the word big. Take a look at that. "Too big lucky, hurt me, I think." Okay. Now, I get what he was trying to say. He was trying to say a lot of, right? He was trying to talk about an amount. He was trying to emphasize a big amount. And so he reached for a vocabulary word that he knew. And in talking with him, we realized that he probably wanted too much, right? Now, big and much, there's a lot of ways that those two vocabulary words have a lot in common. They both have a sense of amount. They both have a sense of a lot of, and yet we don't tend to use big after two, talking about something that's abstract, like luck. We could say the dog was too big, or the book was too big, or the house was too big. But when we're talking about a non-count noun, an abstract noun like love or luck, that kind of thing, or success, we reach for the word much. And that is an example of semantics, right? So the student was reaching for a word, but it wasn't quite the usage. It had a lot of the right meaning to it, but it wasn't quite the right usage. So one of the things that English language learners are developing are semantics. And this is the vocabulary piece. So like I said, if we were to go out and ask people on the street or ask people on the mall, what does it mean to learn a language? What is it that you're learning? A lot of people would say vocabulary, and that's what that is. Okay. So there's another aspect I wanted to highlight in that sentence. Now let's go ahead and switch it to much. "Too much lucky, hurt me, I think." So another thing that I wanted to highlight is this word lucky. And lucky is an adjective, right? So we've added this Y, this suffix, and it's made it an adjective. If we take the Y off, it becomes a noun, luck. And if I take off that Y and say too much luck, now I am forming a sentence like a native-like speaker would. So when we say too much, it needs to be followed by a noun. Too much success, too much love, too much luck, too much education, that kind of thing. So what we need to do is we need to get rid of that Y. That Y makes it an adjective. We need to get rid of that and go back to just the root word luck. And that is an example of morphology. Morphology is, in a language, the root words, the words that can stand on their own, like the word house. In English, that's a root word. It can stand on its own. And morphology is also if you can add parts to the word to change either the grammatical meaning or to change plural, to change tense, that kind of thing. So if we take the word house, is there anything we can add to that as one word just by adding a morpheme? We can add an S, we can add a plural S, we can say houses, okay? So in English, we do tend to use a lot of morphology. In fact, we're very fond of using what are called suffixes. So if you go back to your 7th grade language arts class or some other class where you studied grammar, you probably remember there's root words and then there's affixes. And affixes are those little pieces that you can add to a root word. If they're put at the beginning of the word, it's a prefix. And if you put it at the end of the word, it's a suffix. Okay, so those are all affixes. So in English, we're kind of the middle of the road in terms of how we use morphology. We show past tense by adding ed at the end of most verbs. We show plural by adding s or es to the end of most nouns. And we also can change an adjective like happy into a noun by adding the suffix eness, happiness, right, or the ness part. And so in English we do use morphology, but we're kind of the middle of the road. There are languages that are, they kind of follow extreme morphology. And then there are languages that are kind of morphology averse, right? So we're kind of in the middle of the road. I wanted to give you one example from Finnish to show you one of the most extreme morphological languages that exist. So here's a really quick example from Finnish. Okay. Now I have to kind of contrive an example so you see how this works. Let's say that you and a neighbor are talking, and you own a house on a street, and your neighbor owns 2 houses on the street. And you're talking, and you're hearing that the electric company is going to make a visit to everyone's houses on the street, and they're going to actually shut down the electricity for a little while. And you're telling this to your neighbor, and your neighbor says, in my houses too? In other words, I'm going to have this happen too. So let's just look at how you would say that in English. In my houses too. Okay? So we've got a root word here, house, and then we added a morpheme, the plural s. I'm not sure if that is in a bad place in the light. I hope you can read that. Let me write it again below here. In my houses too. Okay? That's a little bit better, I think. So you've got the root word, house, and then you've added the plural s. So that's an example of using morphology in English. You've got a preposition here of direction, in. You've got a pronoun, a possessive pronoun, my, and you've also got this idea of also, which is too. But we've made those separate words. We've only changed the root word with one morpheme, and that is to make it plural. Now, how would you say that in Finnish? Let's take a look. So in Finnish, the word for house is talo. The word for house is talo. And to make it plural, you add an I. Okay, so far so good. Looks like English. Here is where things go off the rail. So instead of putting in as a separate preposition, whether it's before or after, it actually becomes part of the word. And so we add SSA, and that means in houses, but we can keep going. So we can also say my to show ownership. And again, here in English, we made this a separate word, but here we just added on as another suffix. And we can say to, kin, for to, that's the to part. And then the question, to make a question, we add ko. Pull this over a little bit. Taloisa ni kin ko. That's my best shot at pronouncing it. And so this is a great example of extreme morphology, a language being built around just adding on prefixes, or in this case, suffixes, to carry meaning. We do it a little bit in English, but not like the Finnish do. Now, there are languages that use very few morphemes at all, so they don't use much morphology, which means they really rely on these root words that stand on their own, more like we do in English. So, for example, in Indonesian languages, if there's a cow in the field, you say cow, and if there's more than one, you don't add the equivalent of a plural S or a plural marker like I in Finnish. Instead, you use a linguistic process called reduplication. So you would say cow cow for more than one. That's how you produce the plural. And the same with, if you were talking about one island, I think the word in Indonesian is Palau or Palu, something like that. Reduplication, if you're talking about more than one, you simply say the word twice, island, island, right? And if that seems pretty peculiar, we do that a little bit in English with very, very, or really, really. And I had assumed in my use of Spanish that at least in the form of Nicaraguan Spanish, that they would do that as well. And so I've tried reduplication a few times with, like mucho, mucho, that kind of thing. And they just look at me weird. So I take it that Spanish doesn't use reduplication of adverbs like that. Okay, so that is kind of a sense of how the area of morphology works. And now you have kind of a reminder of how it works in English. And you also have a sense that we're middle of the road. There are those languages that draw upon it much more and those that use it even less than we do. So let's take a look at something that another student said to me. And actually, when I'm collecting homework for students, this is a sentence, and I'm not sure if you can read it with the glare, but it says, I gave you it. I gave you it. So this is often said to me when I'm collecting homework and I look at a student and I'm not sure if I collected theirs or not. Did I get yours, I might say, or did you hand in your homework? And the student might say, I gave you it. I gave you it. So if you take a moment and think about how is that sentence a little bit different from what a native-like speaker would say, you realize it has to do with it coming at the end of the sentence instead of in front of you. So we want to move it here. And we would also use the preposition to. I gave it to you. But the really big issue is moving these two things around. Now, going back to that grammar that you learned in a previous English class or language arts in high school or 7th grade language arts, and you'll remember that one of these is the direct object and the other is the indirect object. The direct object means the thing that's actually receiving the action of the verb. I gave it. It is the thing that's receiving the giving. It's experiencing the giving. The student is actually handing me, right, the paper. And you is the indirect object. It's receiving. See if I can make that glare a little bit better. There we go. You is the indirect object. So it's the person or the thing indirectly receiving the action of the verb. And when we talk about reordering, when the problem is mostly just reordering what comes where in the sentence, that is an issue of syntax. So that is when we're talking about the ordering of words. And often when students are struggling with syntax, usually there are very clear grammar rules that you can draw upon. And one of the things that we'll talk about later in this unit are what are the resources that you can build up for yourself so that you have a place to go to refer to when these issues come up. Because especially for those of you who have acquired English as native speakers, it's going to be more difficult for you to put these rules into words. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So we've looked at Too Big Lucky Hurt Me, I think, and we've talked about I Gave You It. Now let's talk about this one, okay? So years and years ago, when I was working in the English Language Institute and I was teaching a pronunciation class, I had a student from Vietnam in one of my classes, and I was asking students about their opinions about things. And I said, who here thinks that? And several students raised their hand to indicate that they think it. And I said to the student, really? Yeah? You believe that? And he said, I zeally thin that. I zeally thin that. If you look at why that student might have said that, and he meant, I really think that. So if we look at why might he have pronounced it this way, instead of saying, I really think that. There's one reason in here is phonetics, and the other is phonology. So when we look at the zeally, when instead of really, whenever you have a student who speaks another language or speaks another language as their first language, and they're substituting a sound for another sound in English, it's a really big clue for you. It's very possible that that sound does not exist. That phoneme does not exist in their first language. Or another possibility is that the phoneme does exist, but it never begins a word, right? And if that is not quite settling in, you're thinking, how can a sound exist that can only begin words or only end words? Think about this sound, right? The ing sound, ng, ing, okay? We can end words with that sound, right? Can we in English begin words with that sound? No, we can't, unless we're attempting to speak Vietnamese, in which that does begin sometimes the beginning of words. So that's an example from English of a sound that occurs only at the ends of words. So there's two possibilities here. Maybe the sound R, R, doesn't exist in Vietnamese, or maybe it does, but words never begin with it. And it's the case that that word, the R, the way that we think of R in English, for the most part, does not exist in Vietnamese. And so the student was substituting a sound that does exist in Vietnamese, and that was the Z sound. So that is an example of phonetics. We're talking about an individual sound. Now, if we look at the rest of the sentence, we'll notice that the student meant think, and in talking with him, that really was the word that he was reaching for. Now, why would he leave off the k sound? Why would that be left off? Right? So we need the k sound. So when we're talking about phonology, and this is a problem of phonology, we're talking about what happens when sounds bump up against each other. And one of the issues we look at in phonology is what are called consonant clusters. You might not have thought about consonant clusters since you were working, say, with a first or second or third grade student who was learning how to spell school, which has two consonants at the beginning, the S sound and the K sound. Now, if you write the word, it's three consonants at the beginning, SCH, but there's only two sounds. So when you're talking about phonetics and phonology, especially phonology, you really have to think about not the way things are written, but what are the sounds. In English, sometimes we will put several consonants together, but it's just one sound that's being made. And so this is an example of a consonant cluster. We've got the N and the K sound together, ink, think, right? So we start out with the N sound, thing, and then we release the K, k, think, think. And you can hear that K being released. This is a consonant cluster with two consonants together. Now, in some languages, you can have no consonant clusters at all. In others, you can have two consonants together. In some three, and in some languages, you can have four consonants together. In English, the most that we put together are three. And so if you're attempting as a native English speaker or native-like English speaker, you're attempting to learn a language that puts four together, it can be very challenging. So what we have here is we have a student who, when they are faced with a consonant cluster, they chose to leave off the second consonant. And as a matter of fact, in Vietnamese, there are two things working against the student, two things that are kind of interrupting the student's sense of how phonology works in English. And that is, consonant clusters don't exist in Vietnamese, and the last sound, often, the last consonant sound of a word is often left off. So the ends of words are not pronounced often. And so both of those pieces of phonology were interrupting the way the student was pronouncing English. So what they were doing is they were applying what they knew from how Vietnamese works, just like if I were learning Vietnamese, I would be applying what I know about how English works and now how German works and how Spanish works. I would be applying that. And chances are I'd get some of it wrong. And that's what errors are. They're kind of a track of what we're bringing to the process where we haven't quite gotten it yet. Okay? So that is a great example. I Z-leaf in that. That's a great example of phonetics and phonology. Those are two aspects of what students are learning when they're learning English or any language. Now take a look at this one here. See if I can place it in such a way you can read the whole sentence. There we go. Okay. So this one says, you had better change my grade. You had better change my grade. Let me tell you about the situation in which this was said to me. So this was towards the beginning of my career. I was teaching at Indiana University. I had international students, and I was teaching grammar. So I had a course that was entirely focused on grammar. And one of the topics that I had covered, and I was required to cover, and I had covered, was about modals. Modals are the words that we in English put before the verb that indicate whether something's required or not, or indicate how important something is, or whether or not you have permission. So, for example, examples are may, can, should, ought to, and had better. Okay, now as you listen to me say that list, you might have noticed how the change around feeling happened. So can, may, ought to, should, had better. And when we end with had better, there's a whole lot of feeling to that, right? And that's pragmatics. When words are used only in certain contexts, when words are used only in certain relationships, right? They're used by an employer when talking with an employee, or they're used by a parent when talking with a child. That is where pragmatics comes in. When you're choosing the word or choosing how you say something or how directly you say something based on the relationship between you and the other person. So I had really taught my heart out teaching this unit on modals. And the students had to do lots of things to demonstrate that they had mastered it. They had to write sentences, they had to choose modals for sentences to fill them in. They had to do lots of exercises. And really the students had done very well. I was very proud of myself. I was feeling pretty good about myself as a newbie English teacher. And a student who asked to talk with me after class, and he explained that he was not happy with how he'd done on the test. And he wasn't entirely sure if perhaps I had made a mistake in grading the test or whether he just hadn't fully understood it. So there was a lot of room for him. He wasn't quite sure what the problem was. But the way that he ended the conversation was he said this to me: "You had better change my grade." Now, this was a student, and so he wasn't even a university student yet. He was working to become a university student. He had just graduated from high school. I was an instructor at a university, and I was much older than he was at the time. And he was actually a very polite student who was not in any way trying to indicate that I was required to do what he wanted. And yet, this is how he formed his request: "You had better change my grade." Now, grammatically, it's perfect, right? When you look at the morphology, when you look at the syntax, everything's perfect about it. What's not perfect about it is the pragmatics. It's got a feeling, built into that sentence is the feeling that I must do what the student requires of me. And in fact, I'm required to do it. And that's not what he meant at all. And actually, that was a wonderful moment. It was very humbling for me as an instructor, because I realized that even though I had hit the grammar part of teaching modals, I had not hit the pragmatics part. And I realized in that moment, I was very understanding of him, and he was horrified when he realized the mistake he had made. But I realized that pragmatics might be the most important part of language that we learn, because we could really miss or break relationships with other people. So, had better was the modal that he chose, and really asking in a more indirect way, saying, "Could you change my grade? Would you change my grade? Would you consider changing my grade?" Right? All of those, just as grammatically accurate, but the difference is this one's not pragmatically accurate. It didn't capture the relationship, the context, or the situation. And that's what pragmatics is about. So let's go back to our list. Let's go back to our list here. So when we talk about what makes up a language, what is it that someone's actually learning when they're learning a language? These are the pieces that we're now going to tackle in this unit. Semantics, the meaning of words, the use of words, the appropriateness of words, which also touches on pragmatics as well. Morphology, the root words, and whether or not you add other endings or beginnings to the word to change the grammar, to change the meaning, that kind of thing. That's morphology. Syntax, the order of words. And every language has a set way of ordering words. Phonetics and phonology, the sounds of the language and what are the rules for when sounds bump up against each other. So for example, if there's a consonant at the end of a word, do you pronounce it or don't you? That is an example of a rule from a language around phonology. And pragmatics, how do you change your language to be appropriate for a certain context, for a certain audience? Okay? And you might have noticed that you at times think, if you're making a request of a professor, you might think really carefully about how you're going to ask that and how much time you're going to use explaining your request. Versus if you're just asking your best friend that you've known for years something, you may not put much thought at all into it, and you may not even give a reason. You just may say, hey, can you drive me to the mall? And you don't give any explanation. Whereas even if you're asking a small thing of a professor, like could you stay after class for a few minutes, you probably would give a reason. I'm really struggling to catch up, or I'm really struggling to understand this term, that kind of thing. So those are all examples that your pragmatic functions are working well, that you change your language for the context, for the whatever the request is and who you're talking with. So where do we go next? What do we do next? Okay, so there's some serious work in front of you, and it is meant entirely to give you a deeper sense of what these different systems mean. And you're going to watch some videos, do a little bit of reading, and then you're going to do some practice exercises. So the first place to go after this video is to watch a video called Systems of Language. And it's a really nice, really quick graphic arts video that looks over these systems and how they work. Although it may leave off pragmatics. I think it might leave off pragmatics. And then where you go after that is there's a video on morphology. And if this is something that you've always struggled with, or maybe even when I say root words and bound morphemes and that kind of thing, if that scares you, if that sets off some anxiety, then this is a great video for you especially. It'll kind of remind you, you already know how English works. This will remind you and give you those terms again that you can use. There's also a video on pragmatics, and it's a really quick 3-minute overview given by a very famous person in our profession, David Crystal. And he approaches it a little bit differently than I do and a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, but I think it'll be good for you to hear from him what pragmatics means to him. And then there's a very brief reading as well on pragmatics to give you a sense of what are some of those ways that we change our language, okay? So where do you go after that? After you've absorbed this lecture, after you've watched those videos and read that brief piece on pragmatics, what I want you to do is I want you to put yourself in the position of a teacher of English language learners. And I want you to do 3 exercises in which you're thinking about syntax, you're thinking about morphology, and you're thinking about pragmatics. So you will find practice exercises about syntax in which they are sentences that are not expressed in a native-like way. Something about the syntax isn't quite right. So the first thing you need to do is to identify where is it not quite right. And then the next thing to do is to figure out what's the rule. A rule's been broken, a rule hasn't been followed. What is the rule? And then what's really key for English language learners is that you're able to give them more evidence that there's this rule that exists. So for example, with me, when I'm getting feedback about my Spanish from my friends in Nicaragua, it's not that I don't believe them. It's not that I think that they're telling me the wrong information, but I just, as a Spanish learner, I need to see evidence that this rule is in use. I need to see examples of it. So what you'll do is you'll come up with examples. The next exercise is the same thing, but with morphology. You'll see a list of utterances that are not quite native-like, and you'll identify where the problem is with morphology, you'll identify the rule, and then you'll come up with some examples to show a student how it works in English. And the final one, it's actually 2 conversations, 2 phone conversations, And in the first conversation, you will read it, and there are no breakdowns in communication. There's no breakdowns in pragmatics. And so you'll kind of get a sense of what the ideal form of this conversation would look like. Right below it, you will see a phone conversation in which there are breakdowns in pragmatics. And what you need to do is to identify where are those breakdowns. And the student, the person in the second dialogue who obviously doesn't quite understand all the pragmatic rules of English, what is it that she doesn't understand? Go ahead and put those into words. So tackle all of that, and once you do, you will have a really good beginning sense of the ways that those in our profession think about and use linguistics to give feedback to their English language learners, to help them along to where they need to be with their English development. Okay, good luck with the work.